blockbuster directed by Francis Ford Coppola, Richard Gere, Diane Lane, Gregory Hines, a $58 million budget. It should have been a triumph. Instead, The Cotton Club became one of Hollywood's most cursed films. Why? Because behind the cameras lurked the Medellín Cartel. Carlos Lehder's cocaine empire reached Florida, then Los Angeles, and into a limousine where producer Roy Radin took his last ride. He never came back. Was it scandal that doomed the movie, or something darker? The truth is a reel spliced with powder and blood. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Laura. From Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime to local legends whispering Latin intrigue, every tale is triple verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe. Fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. A film that died twice. They said it died twice, first under hot lights, then under cold stars. Once on the soundstage, where chandeliers lit every dollar like an interrogation, and once more beneath the marquee, where the jazz played sweet but the seats stayed empty. But in Hollywood, nothing ever truly dies. It lingers, like smoke in a wardrobe or a whisper on a reel. And The Cotton Club, a film meant to be a coronation, was buried in its own myth long before the critics carved it into a failure. Francis Ford Coppola had returned from apocalypse and opera to make this one sing. Richard Gere would play the crooner in danger. Gregory Hines would dance until the curtains begged for mercy. And Diane Lane would smile like a blade. At the center stood Robert Evans, once the golden prince of Paramount, exiled but unbroken. This would be his redemption. Harlem's jazz palace reborn. A gangster epic wrapped in a nightclub's velvet hush. But coronations require coin. And in the Hollywood of the early 80s, money didn't always come clean. Sometimes it arrived in trunks. Sometimes they are found in briefcases with no names on the latch. Sometimes it wore perfume and lied about what business it was really in. The serpent from the south, long before the lights of Los Angeles blinked awake, another kind of empire was rising. Far to the south, past Panama, a Colombian man named Carlos Lehder carved an airstrip out of a Bahamian dream, Norman's Cay. His gift wasn't invention, it was volume. He took cocaine out of the shadows and scaled it like a business. He built an airborne toll road. Medellin's growers would hand over 4 kilos, and for every 4, Lehder would take 1 as tribute. In return, he'd make sure it landed safely and whole on U.S. soil. That runway became legend, not just because of the millions it minted, but because it stitched together the hunger of the North and the recklessness of the South. Miami turned into a powder engine, and standing at the wheel of that distribution machine was a man few would remember outside the Florida sun, Larry Greenberger. He ran the cutting houses, shipped product west, made the cash move with military cadence. They say he was Lehder's number 2 in the state, but even kings need marriages to keep their empires stable. The woman with many names. They called her Lanie in Los Angeles. Karen is in court. The bank called Karen Delane Jacobs, Karen Greenberger, when she slipped the ring on and learned where the real money moved. She had the voice of a Southern belle and the instincts of a border lord. 2 homes, one for parties, one for product. In one, there was champagne. In the other, safes lined with coke and cash. She was a bridge, not just between men, but between industries. When she wasn't dealing kilos, she was whispering in the ears of producers. And in that whisper wrote a promise. I know people who have the money you need. It was a limo driver, moonlighting between stars, who introduced her to Robert Evans. The prince needed a war chest. She brought Roy Radin, 66 rooms of Long Island ego, a vaudeville huckster dressed like Gatsby's ghost. He wanted to be in the pictures. She wanted a cut, and Evans wanted redemption on celluloid. Together, they struck a match, but nobody asked who was holding the gas. The deal that turned to smoke Radin promised millions. First 50, then 35. A Puerto Rican banker was summoned like a saint. Contracts were drawn. Percentages were carved into the air. But Lanie wanted more. She hadn't just fetched the players, she'd arranged the stage. She asked for more than a finder's fee. She wanted a seat, ownership, legacy. Radin, still drunk on his imagined Hollywood coronation, shut her out. He had the papers. He had the charm. He had no idea the house he was building stood on someone else's bones. And beneath their negotiations, something else had cracked. Lanie had been robbed. 10 kilos, hundreds of thousands in cash. Whispers danced between walls. Radin knew the thief. Or was the thief? What started as a deal became a riddle of betrayal, the kind of silence before a storm. And the storm came wearing a limousine and a dinner invitation. The last ride of Roy Radin. It was Friday, May 13th, 1983. Roy Radin dressed like someone who believed nothing bad ever happened to men with money. Lanie said dinner. La Scala, Beverly Hills. He agreed, but Radin brought insurance. A friend. Actor Demon Wilson, Sanford's son, followed the limo with a gun in his lap and a prayer that this night would stay simple. But Los Angeles has a way of making the simple disappear. Somewhere along Sunset, the trail vanished. The limousine did not arrive. The desert kept its silence for weeks. Then a body, decomposed, wrists bound, face blasted as if the killer wanted not just death, but erasure. The papers called it the Cotton Club murder, as if jazz itself had pulled the trigger. 4 names and a circle. It took years to find the voices that would talk. A former Hustler security chief wore a wire. Bodyguards bragged in poker rooms. William Menser, Alex Marty, Robert Lowe, and Karen Greenberger, all charged, all tried. In 1991, the jury read the gospel of justice: first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and aggravated kidnapping. Life sentences like bricks dropped into a well, but one detail remained. A name whispered by one of the accused, a Miami figure, a drug man, the one who hired him for another job. They showed the witness a photo. "That's Vinny D'Angelo," he said. The police nodded. "That's Larry Greenberger." The bullet on the porch. September 1988, Okeechobee, Florida. A house with lion-topped pillars. A man with a bullet in his skull and a pistol in his hand. Lanie said suicide. The coroner said no. The sheriff said it was staged. This wasn't Hollywood, but the scene smelled like a theater. The case went nowhere, but it didn't have to. By then, Los Angeles had enough to tie her to Roy Radin's death. And in that circle of flame, Carlos Lehder, Larry Greenberger, Karen Jacobs, Roy Radin, Robert Evans, a line had been drawn in cocaine dust and film stock. The cartel hadn't signed a check, but the shadow was all over the ledger. A dream in flames. The Cotton Club opened in December 1984 with jazz and glitter. But 9 days earlier, Beverly Hills Cop had snuck into theaters like a riot in sneakers. Eddie Murphy laughed America into a box office trance. While the band played on screen, the audience went elsewhere. Budget, $58 million. Gross, barely $26 million. Behind the scenes, chaos. Evans is fighting Coppola. Coppola is cutting the Hines brothers to satisfy white investors. The heart of Harlem dimmed to please bankers. Years later, Coppola would recut the film, restore the music, the rhythm, the thunder, but the damage had already been released. A dream isn't killed by one thing. It's drowned, slowly, in money, in fear, in scandal, shadows on the ledger. The Medellín Cartel didn't write a check to Orion Pictures, but their fingerprints were all over the room. Carlos Lehder taught the North to crave faster. Larry Greenberger moved the product west. Lanie turned cocaine into clout. Roy Radin tried to turn clout into movies, and Robert Evans tried to turn movies into salvation. They spoke different languages, but they all knew the dialect of deals. Hollywood wants money, fast, silent, tuxedo clean. Cocaine wants respectability, paperwork, legacy, a seat at the premiere. What you get is a marriage of desperation, and when the vows are broken, somebody ends up in a canyon with a bullet in his face. The white serpent in the spotlight. This is how the serpent moves, from the coca leaves of Antioquia to Norman's Cay's coral teeth, to a Sherman Oaks safe, to a Beverly Hills limo, to a box office stained by blood. In Harlem's original Cotton Club, the music soared while the black audience stood outside. Decades later, a film about that irony was edited to hide the same discomfort. And decades after that, the director put back what had been erased. But restoration doesn't change history. It only invites it to speak again. This is not just a story about a movie. It is a story about an empire. One empire wore lapels, the other wore machetes. One filmed jazz, the other trafficked thunder. And when they touched, the screen flickered. A man died, a dream collapsed, and Hollywood pretended not to notice how familiar the powder already smelled. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's darkest stories are far from over.